There are lots of ways you can join two boards together. You can rely on a physical fastener like a screw or a nail. You can use glue, or you can cut joints that lock themselves together. In this video, I'm going to show you 9 basic joints that we use all the time in the Wood Magazine shop. Knowing these joints, you can build yourself bookcases, cabinets, doors, drawers, just about any type of project you'd like. And the best thing is, most of them are cut with a table saw, or with a router, or at the router table. So let's get started. Let's first talk about one of the most basic joints, one that probably everyone starts with. It's a screw joint. And this is simply a way that you can join two pieces at pretty much a right angle if you screw through the thickness of one into another piece, whether you're joining them face to face, or the top of a cabinet down into the cabinet side, or if you're going through a side of a cabinet into a shelf or a divider of some sort. You can use a screw joint. Let's take a look at what makes up a screw joint. I've got one here that I've cut away, and of course you've got the screw here. Here's the upright piece and the mating piece. With a screw joint, typically you will drill what's called a pilot hole. That is a small hole that the screw feeds into. It's just slightly smaller than the diameter of the screw, so the threads bite in. In the old days, let's say, you'd also drill a shank hole in this piece here. The shank hole allowed the screw to pass through without the threads biting in. That way, when the threads bite into the lower piece, it really draws those two pieces tightly together. Nowadays, at least in the wood shop, we are using what are called production screws. You need only drill a pilot hole through both pieces, and then the tip of the screw has a little self-tap, and it pulls the pieces together, or bores through, and as the screw gets there, it pulls those pieces together nice and tightly. On this piece, you can also see that the head of the screw has this taper on it, and the head is sitting just a little bit under the surface of the top piece here. That area, a little depression where the head of the screw sits, is called a countersink. And you can drill that in one of two ways. I mean, there are bits that bore the countersink, or you can buy a bit such as this. This has a tapered drill bit, and then at the very tip you can see these little tapered teeth. Those will bore the countersink, and this collar around the top here stops the bit, prevents it from going any deeper than it has to, so that your countersink is only as deep as it needs to be to set the screw head flush with the mating piece. As you look at a piece, of course, if you've got screw joints all along here, you may not like the appearance of that screw head. So there are several ways you can hide that. You can drill what's called a counterbore, essentially a countersink that's deep enough to allow the head of the screw to recess below the surface. Then you can plug that counterbore in a variety of ways. Now here on this board, I'm showing you this is how it would look from the surface. We've got a screw set into a countersink. Then there are 3 types of ways you can hide the head of a screw. These two here are end grain plugs. Those are simply cut from a dowel. I've got an oak dowel to match my oak wood here, and then in the counterbore, just stick in the dowel, cut off a short length of it, glue it in, and then cut and sand it flush after the glue dries. Now I've got 2 of them here. This one, you can see neither one really makes much difference in how one is oriented at 90 degrees to the other. But it really makes not much difference in how they're oriented because it's end grain, so it's always going to look a little bit different than the face grain on which they're applied. Another method you can hide counterbores with is to use what are called button plugs. Now these are kind of mushroom-shaped caps. They come pre-packaged. You can buy them in packs of 25 and 100 and probably even larger than that. But these little plugs simply glue into the counterbore, and you can see by their design they're meant to sit high, so they can be used as a decorative element on your piece. You can also see that to a degree you can sort of blend them in. This one, the grain runs the same direction as the face piece. This one I chose because it's got a little dark grain in it. It's just kind of ugly looking compared to the face grain, and it's sitting at an angle to the face grain. So this one pops out quite a bit more than this one. Probably the easiest way and the best way to really blend in a plug is to cut your own out of stock, similar to what you're building your project out of. And I'll show you how to do that in just a minute, but you can see here are two plugs that have been cut from face grain with a plug cutter. This one, again, the grain is oriented at 90 degrees to the face grain, so you can see your eye is kind of drawn to it. It kind of pops out. This top one, I've oriented to run again. The grain is parallel with the face grain of the project part, so it blends in pretty well. So if you're going to use screw joints, you sometimes have to find a way to hide them, and these are really your three options. Let's talk about how we can make the holes, the counterbores, and the plugs to first make a screw joint and then also to hide your plugs. Let's say we're making a shallow box and this is going to be one side, it'll be screwed through into the mating side here. The piece that I'm going to drive the screws through, I'm just clamped to my bench here. I've got a scrap backer board here. What that'll do is prevent the back side of that board from splitting out as the drill bit comes through. I've also got it extended over the edge of my bench back here so that I don't drill into my workbench. I'm going to do this with just a couple of drill bits. I'm going to take, this is a 3/8 inch bit. I'm going to drill the counterbore first. But I need to know where to drill. My piece is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I want to center my screws on that thickness. That's 3/8 of an inch. Square is set at 3/8, and just drag it along here. Make a mark. Now if I want to be real precise, I could also measure in from each edge so that they're the same distance in, give it a nice uniform look. So there's one spot, there's the spot for my second screw. I want to drill down just deep enough that the screw head will disappear below the surface. Don't overdo it. Now the nice thing about using a brad point bit like I had there is after you drill the counterbore, you end up with a nice little dimple down in the center of that counterbore. That gives you the perfect place to register the drill bit for drilling the pilot hole. Now to drill a pilot hole, I'm actually going to have to drill a pilot hole into the mating piece. Screwing into end grain like this without a pilot hole is just asking to split your workpiece. What I like to do is I put it on the end vise here, match the pieces up, clamp one in place, line up the edges. And I'm going to change out my drill bit to my pilot hole size. Now again, I've got a perfect spot to place my drill bit, make sure things are straight up and down. Then drill in. Drill my second. Now with a screw joint, you can add glue if you want. One thing is that your one mating surface here is end grain, so end grain doesn't provide a real strong glue surface, but it does provide a little bit of extra adhesion if you want. So if you want to add glue, you certainly may. Then simply drive the screws in. And there's our screw joint. Then I can cut plugs to cover those, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Now, instead of messing around with two drill bits, earlier I showed you this single bit where you've got a bit and a countersink in here. By moving this collar up, you can also bore deeper to create a counterbore. So in one step, you can drill the pilot hole, the countersink, and the counterbore. Okay, now that's mounted, it's set for a nice countersink. What I want to do is pull this collar back so I can drill a counterbore. There's a Allen key on each side here that secures it to that portion of the bit. Loosen those up. I'm going to slide those back. And I don't want this counterbore to be more than half the depth of my workpiece. I'm just going to quick check here. Not going to be super precise, but I want to make sure I'm not going too deep. That's about right. Tighten up the Allen key on each side. And now, with just one bit, I'm ready to drill the pilot hole, the countersink, and the counterbore. So there's my pieces, nice counterbores. Screw things together. So there we go, a good screw joint. I've got my counterbores there, and when it comes time to plug them, I can again use these little mushroom buttons that'll fit in there. Or if I want to cut a piece of dowel plug to go in there, it's as simple as putting it in there, then just taking a pencil and making a mark on there to indicate how long a piece you need. Then you can cut that off and glue it in. You don't have to be real precise here. You want to make it a little long because after the glue dries, you're going to cut it flush and sand it off. So that's all there is for my end grain plug. Dab of glue. And I like to put the glue into the counterbore. You get less chance of getting squeeze out on the surface that way. Just a little dab there. Press that in place. And you can see it extends above the surface a little bit, exactly what I want, so I can come back with a sanding block, some sandpaper, sand it flush, help it blend in. Now the third way that I showed you earlier to cover the counterbore is by making a face grain plug, and that's done at the drill press with a special bit called a plug cutter. So let's go to the drill press, I'll show you how to do that. So this is a 3/8 inch plug cutter. We're using 3/8 because we drilled 3/8 inch counterbore. These do come in other sizes. You can get 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch, or whatever your needs are. And you can use them in a handheld drill if you like. I think you get a lot better results in a drill press because you're drilling straight down in and you don't end up going slightly off at an angle. And it can be a pretty big bite to try to take with a handheld drill. Okay, that's mounted in the drill press, but before we start cutting plugs, let's talk a little bit about your selection of stock. Now here's the counterbore that we're going to be filling. You can see that's got a fairly straight grain on there. I want to find a piece of scrap that's got a grain pattern and a color that matches that. This piece, for example, not a real good choice because I've got a lot of cathedral grain there, straight grain on the piece I'm trying to match. So I did find a piece that has much straighter grain. You can see those two look very similar, so when I get a plug cut from this straighter grain, it's going to blend much better with the face grain here. Using this is really very simple. You put a fence below the bit and then bring the bit down, and you want to set the stop so it goes about 2/3 of the way through the bit. I've got a 3/4 inch thick piece here, so I'm going to go down about a little over 1/2 inch. Okay, now, when you're drilling plugs, if you're going to drill one, you might as well make a whole bunch, and that way you can have a little bit of a stock on hand, especially if you've got a project that's going to need a dozen or 50 plugs. Drill as many as you need at once. You're always going to have a couple that roll off the bench onto the floor, so have an extra stock. This can happen on occasion. You may get plugs that actually snap off while you're drilling them, and they'll get stuck in the bit. Just if you have to take the bit out, get a screwdriver, whatever, and pop those out of there, then you can keep drilling. Okay, so there's a blank full of plugs that's ready to be popped out. Occasionally the bit will help you with popping them out, but you sometimes can't salvage these. The best way to get these out of the blank is you can sometimes just take a screwdriver, reach in there, and they might pop free like that. There's a couple of plugs ready to go. The other method is you can take this blank to the bandsaw, do a little resawing, and they'll fall right out. So there is a handful of face grain plugs, and those will fit right into the counterbore. Now to glue these, I find it's really easy just to put a little dab of glue on a piece of scrap, then dab these in. Wipe off, you don't need too much there, and then just give it a twist in. And again, you want to look to orient the grain in line with the face grain of the workpiece. Now let that glue dry. And when the glue is dry, obviously you want to come back and trim this off. You can do that with a chisel, just working gently around, all the way around, to pop off the majority of that extra waste. And then with a sanding block, like we've done with our dowel plug here, you can just take a sanding block, sand that down flush, and they'll pretty much disappear. Next joint we're going to talk about is called pocket screw joinery, pocket hole joints. If you look at this cutaway, you can see where it gets its name. There is a small pocket that is drilled into one piece, an angled pocket, and then a screw, the flathead type washer head, is driven into that hole, and it bites into the mating piece, pulls things close, and joins the two pieces together. That's the cutaway. You can see this is what it looks like when the joint is actually, hole is drilled and the screw is driven. That hole not real attractive, so there are some ways to cover that up, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Where might you use pocket hole screws? Well, when you have a typical screw joint, you're limited to the fact that you can only drill and drive a screw through the thickness of one of the work pieces. With pocket hole screws, you can do a much wider variety of types of joinery. Here we've got two boards that are joined edge to edge. Here, two boards that are joined end to end. These two, we have a typical butt joint, where you might have the top of a cabinet into the side of a cabinet, or a divider of a cabinet. Got a screw hole there. Pocket hole joints are very versatile. You can use them for making face frames, all types of joints, and they're very simple to do. What you need is a special jig and drill bit. This is the jig, and this is the drill bit. What's special about this is you'll notice the little nose here at the end. That's what drills the pilot hole into the mating piece. You've got the shaft of it that drills the actual pocket hole itself, and then at the top is a stop collar that limits the depth to which you're drilling. So it takes me about as long to explain it as it does to show it, so let me just drill one for you. I've got a couple pieces of stock here. Clamp that into the jig, and then drill a couple of holes. There's my holes. Let's say I want to make a T-joint such as that. Put the mating piece right next to it. And to hold them in position while I drive the screws, you can get these clamps, broad-faced clamps, and clamp it to your bench. And then with another driver, drive the screws home. And just that quick, we've got a nice strong joint. Pocket hole joints are very strong. On an end grain to edge grain joint like this, if you want to add glue, you can. You don't have to, but because you're not getting a whole lot of extra strength. But if you want to glue a joint, you can. But one of the nice things about pocket hole joinery is that if you have a piece that you might want to take apart, or you're just checking a fit, you can easily back the screws out to disassemble a part. It's not something you want to do repeatedly. If you're building knockdown furniture, for example, it may not be the best choice, but you can temporarily assemble something and then come back and disassemble it at another time. You have a couple of strategies for dealing with the actual pocket holes. You can put them on parts of the furniture where they won't be seen. For example, on a face frame, if this is going to be the face frame of a cabinet, you'd see this face, the pocket holes will be hidden on the back side. You'll never see that. Likewise, if I was building, say, a door, this would be the rail, pocket holes will be on the back. When that door opens, you're likely to see those holes, and that's where plugs come in. You can buy these in a variety of species. So if you're building from oak, they've got oak plugs. If you're building from cherry, there's cherry plugs and walnut plugs. Pine also available, a variety of species. What you do with a plug is simply apply a little glue in there, tap that plug in until it seats, tap on the flat part here until it seats itself, let the glue dry, then come back and sand that flush. It works pretty well. Here is the hole, and here next to it is a hole with a plug that's been glued in and sanded flat. Now as I drilled these and drove the screws, you noticed I've got two drills set up. I prefer to use a corded drill for drilling the holes. That requires a lot of power, and frankly a cordless drill may not last very long. You find yourself swapping batteries out quite a bit. You've got a lot of pocket holes to drill. So a corded drill has the power and the endurance to drill a lot of holes. Then you can use your cordless drill for driving the screws into the pieces. You can find these jigs. They're manufactured by a number of companies, and you can find them, a lot of them at home centers, lumber yards, and specialty woodworking catalogs. One of the most basic joints in woodworking is simple edge-to-edge glue joints. It's the way you can make wide panels like this one. If you tried to find a single board of quarter sawn oak that's as wide as this, good luck. This actually is 3 separate boards of narrower widths that have been glued at their edges to make this wider panel. Now when woodworkers first get started and they're hearing about joining 2 boards edge to edge with nothing but glue in between them, they're a little bit skeptical. How can glue be strong enough to hold boards together like that? Well, let me give you a little demonstration that hopefully will illustrate how strong modern glues actually are. This is 3 pieces of poplar I've glued together. You can see that I've left the glue squeeze out there on the joint, so you can see I didn't cheat and use too much glue or too little glue. This is about a properly glued joint. I'm going to see if I can break this and see if this breaks the wood or if it breaks the glue joint. Now, take a look at that. So I think that pretty clearly demonstrates the strength of the glue joint compared to the actual strength of the wood. This split right along the grain of the wood, the glue joint is fully intact. Right down here at the very tip, you can see that the wood did peel away, but it's still attached to the mating piece. The glue joint did not fail, the wood failed. That's what you're going to hear a lot, is glue joints are stronger than the wood they bond, so have no fear when you're edge gluing boards. When you are edge gluing boards, there's a couple things that you need to know about. Number one is, unless there's glue on the surface of the boards, you don't get any adhesion. And that may sound rather simple, but here's what I mean by that. If you look at these 2 boards, you can see between them, we've got a pretty good gap going right there. Now you can put glue along there, but the glue doesn't touch both boards. Those 2 boards don't touch there, so the glue is not going to create a strong bond. What you need is a true surface on each board so that you get a nice tight joint line like you saw on these other 2 panels. And there's a couple of ways you can create that. One way, the simplest way perhaps, is simply to go to the table saw and rip a clean edge on each board. So let's do that. Okay, over here at the table saw, let's say I want to join these 2 boards just like that. I'm going to mark these just so we can keep them straight as the process goes through here. I'm going to call this board number 1 and this board number 2. Now this is the edge at which they'll mate, so I want to rip each of those edges. I'm just going to mark that again just so I can keep it straight and you can see clearly what I'm doing. What I want to do is to rip one with this good face up and rip the other one with the good face down. The reason for that is if my blade isn't perfectly 90 degrees, those two angles will offset each other. So when the board comes together, the angles offset and the panel will stay flat. So let's rip the first one. A good 40-tooth blade, you need a very sharp blade to get the best edge possible. So a good 40-tooth multi-purpose blade, or there are what they call glue line rip blades, perfect for this job. Now when I bring those two boards together, you can see I've got a nice clean joint line from one end to the other. And sitting here on my cast iron surface of the table saw, you can see that those two boards lay flat. Okay, I've got the edges prepared. The next thing is to do the glue up. Now the first question we have when you're ready to do a glue up is, if you've never done it before, how much glue do you use? Well, enough. And it's one of those things, after you've done it a couple times, you know. Start with a bead about like that, then just you can use a spreader or a brush if you'd like. I prefer using a finger because it's always there, I know where it is. Spread it so you get a thin, even coat along the full face of that edge. You want to go from one face to the other, end to end, cover it with an even coat of glue. Then simply lay it down on your clamps, lay the mating face down, and the next question is, how much clamping pressure do I need? And again, the answer, just like the glue, just enough. All you need is enough to bring those boards together firmly, and if you've applied glue as I just showed you, you'll see a thin bead start to pop up along your joint line. That's another sign, another way you can tell if you've got the proper amount of glue. We've got just a thin little bead of glue popping up along that joint line. Then I can take my square or any kind of straight edge, check along there, make sure the boards aren't bowing up or bowing down. Sometimes clamps will tend to force those up. That's staying nice and flat on both ends. If by chance you're having a little trouble getting that joint line to align, just take a clamp such as this and clamp along that joint line to bring those into alignment. That'll keep the panel a lot flusher and save you planing and surfacing after the glue dries. So that's one method for making edges for edge gluing panels, using a table saw and a nice sharp blade to get your true edges. There's also a special machine called a jointer that you can add to your shop, very useful, and its job is to make jointed edges. Let's look at the jointer. The jointer is kind of a specialized tool, but it's perfect for making really clean edges for joining things up. It consists of an in-feed table here, an out-feed table here, then under this red guard, we've got the cutter head that rotates. To use the jointer, I'm going to do similar to what I did on the table saw. I want my pieces to line up like this. I'll number this one number 1, this one number 2. Then what I'll do is I'll joint one with the number facing out, one with the number facing in. That again will offset any variation from 90 degrees in the fence. So let's joint. Start by applying light pressure to keep the edge of the board on the in-feed table. After about 6 inches of the board passes onto the out-feed table, shift pressure to that end of the board. You can hear the cutter head cutting at each end of the board, but not in the middle. With each pass, the edge gets flatter until the full length of the board is being jointed. Two nice clean edges, and when they come together, joint line practically disappears. Then you can go ahead and glue this up just as we did with the other panel. It's been about 20 minutes since we first glued up this panel, so I want to come back to it and give you another tip on your glue ups. The glue is starting to set up by this time. You want to leave the glue up in the clamps for at least an hour, even longer if you can. However, we talked about the little bit of glue squeeze out that occurs along this joint line. You want to get rid of that before it cures too hard. Back on this panel we broke, I left that bead in place, and glue dries, it gets very hard. And not only does it get hard, but it can also, if you try to take it off at this stage, it can peel up little wood fibers because, again, the glue is stronger than the wood. So it's better to come back to your glue up at this point. You can see those little beads. They're just getting to be kind of jelly-like. You can press on them. They feel a bit like pudding. Bring a chisel along and just gently scrape those off. Get rid of them before they turn into those hard beads later on. Again, about 20 minutes is what you want to wait until you see those little beads appear. So there's that face. I'm going to turn it over and work on the other face too. Now reclamp that. Let that sit for, I'm going to give it another hour, hour and a half before I remove the clamps, and that panel will be ready to go. Miter joints are a nice way that you can join two boards and really hide all the end grain. You've got two 45-degree cuts that come together to form a 90-degree angle. For example, this is a plywood shelf for a project. To hide those plywood edges, we've mitered two pieces of edging, come together nicely at a 90-degree corner here, and it wraps the shelf and hides that plywood edging, makes the whole thing a little more attractive. Cutting a couple of miter joints like that, really not too much of a problem. When you get into more traditional miter, where you're using strictly miters for joinery, you're making a frame. You've got 4 miter joints. One problem with miter joints, they do have the advantage of hiding the end grain, but on the other side, you're pretty much gluing end grain to end grain there, so you don't have a terribly strong joint. So you need to come up with some way to reinforce that joint. And I'm going to show you 4 methods for that in just a moment. First, let's talk about cutting the miters themselves. You have to be very precise when you're cutting 4 miters. You've actually got 8 cuts here, 2 on each piece, and each cut has to be dead on, because if you're off, say, 1/4 of 1 degree 8 times, by the time you get to that last corner, that's a total of 2 degrees. You'll end up with a gap here. So let's go to the table saw, and I'll show you how to set things up and test your cuts first to end up with gap-free corners before you're ready to glue up a frame. To cut accurate miters, you need a miter gauge. It's always a good idea to put an auxiliary face on your miter gauge for a couple of reasons. Extend it past the blade, and that little extension will help push the waste past the blade. It also backs up the cut so that the back side of the workpiece where the blade is exiting, it reduces tear out. So if you've got that essentially a zero clearance cut there, you'll get much cleaner cuts. The first thing I'm going to do here, I've got my miter gauge set for 45 degrees, and I want to make one cut right through my auxiliary fence. Now that cut shows me exactly where the blade's going to cut, so that also helps me when it comes time to align my pieces. I've got 4 test pieces here. They're the same length, and I've got the same width. I'm just going to start mitering one end of each one, and then we'll come back and miter the opposite ends, and we'll show you how to assemble a frame to test if you've got an exact 45-degree setup on your miter gauge. Okay, so there is one end mitered. Now I need to miter the opposite end. And it's also important that, in this case, I want a square frame. All 4 pieces are going to end up the same length. That's where this comes in. This particular miter gauge comes with its own stop block built on. You can just as easily make a stop block by taking a piece of scrap and clamping it right to the face of your auxiliary fence. So I'm going to flip this down, turn my piece around and adjust this so I'm making a cut on the opposite end. And the important thing to remember, of course, is that your miters face each other. So there I'm cut, so I'm just taking off as little as possible. I'm going right through the corner of my cuts, so I'll cut each of these 4 pieces, and we'll assemble our frame. Now for a quick assembly, I think it's easy just to go ahead and do this right up against the rip fence on the table saw. It gives you one solid surface to work with. Put one there, 2, 3, and now I can check my 4 corners. 2 up against the rip fence are nice and tight. This 3rd one down here is nice and tight. Up there, we've got a pretty good gap. And it looks like things are splaying this way. So we need to take just a little bit off the heel of each one of these cuts, the inside corner of each one of these miters. This is going to be a very small adjustment because again 8 cuts, and I want to take essentially 1/8 of that error off each miter. Now make an adjustment that fine. I could try adjusting the miter gauge, but there's a simpler way, and I think even it allows you to fine tune better. Just take a business card or a playing card and put it behind the piece toward the end that needs to be touched up a little bit. Now I want to move the piece out this way to increase that angle, so I'm going to put the business card right back there and get a piece of tape just to hold it in place so it doesn't move during my 8 different cuts. My first cut, I'm going to move the stop in just a little bit, so I'm going to shave just a little bit off that, make 1 cut on each end of all 4 pieces, move the stop in just a little bit more, and chop the other end. So let's do that. We'll check our fit. With one end of each piece cut, I move the stop in slightly before cutting the opposite end of each piece. There, we've got a pretty good fit with 1 business card adjustment. I think we've got things dialed in where we want, and we are ready to start cutting the actual pieces for our frame. Okay, so here are the 4 pieces for my frame, and I'm going to glue them up using a band clamp. These are very handy when you come time to glue up 4 mitered pieces. If you try to hold 4 mitered pieces, well, you saw a little bit of that, the saw, you try to hold all 4 corners at once, they slide a little bit on each other. A band clamp like this will grab each corner and pull them all toward the center, gets the joints nice and tight, keeps things from slipping around. Gluing it up, not too difficult. Just a dab of glue on each miter. And like when you're edge joining boards, you want to make sure that glue covers the full surface. I put some brown paper down on top of my bench top to make sure I don't get any glue on the bench, and, or even worse, glue the frame to the bench top. And I've got the 4 pieces in approximate position. Just tug on that band to cinch things up and tighten this screw down to pinch the band. And now a twist of the handle to help tighten things up further. You're going to have to slide pieces against each other, make sure the inside and outside corners are aligned, and do work quickly. I can feel the glue already starting to grab on this one. Okay, inside and outside corners all aligned, and don't have to get too Herculean on our effort here for the band clamp, just enough to keep those corners closed. And I can see that the frame is also lying nice and flat on the bench. It doesn't have any twist to it. That's good. So now, with like any other glue up, allow that to dry for at least an hour, preferably longer, before I remove the clamps. As I mentioned, miter joints are really an inherently weak joint. You've got end grain to end grain. So it's best to, if you have a frame, to reinforce those miter joints if you can. And as I said, there's going to be 4 ways to do that I'll show you. Our first is pretty simple. Using good old wire nails. Now you don't want to take these and just grab the hammer and start driving these home. You're going to end up splitting your frame. Instead, put a drill bit in your drill and drill pilot holes for the nails. So there's one method. Now obviously the nails may not be the most attractive option. Another way you can do the same thing with a mechanical fastener, isn't quite as obvious, is with a pin nailer. This is, I believe, a 22 gauge. It runs off compressed air. In just a couple of quick shots, you're going to have to look closely. The heads of those pins are very, very small, so they're very difficult to see, which is the idea. So there's two of our four methods. Our third involves putting a gusset across the corner. We'll take essentially a little bite out of this corner, about like that, and then glue in a piece of wood to reinforce that corner, getting a lot of face grain to face grain glue surface. Now you can make that, it's called a gusset. You can put that gusset across the back of the frame so it's hidden, or you can treat it as an accent, a design accent, perhaps glue in a contrasting species and put it on the front of the frame. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put it in on the front of the frame, and what we'll do is go to the table saw, cut a shallow groove across here to accept that gusset. This is the stock I'm going to use for the gusset. It's going to be some maple that will contrast, I think, nicely with the mahogany, especially when I get a finish on it. So I need to cut a gap, or a recess in the corner of the frame. That's actually just a little bit less than the thickness of my gusset. So I'm going to just use this as a gauge right next to the blade to set my blade height. I want the top of the blade just below the top of my gusset material. Lock the blade height in place, and that's taken care of. I want to make that cut so it's just, I'm going to leave it about a 1/4 inch or so from the inside corner of the frame. So now I need to position that using my stop block on my miter gauge. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this one. The measurement isn't critical. I like the look of that there. So I'm going to bring the stop block up and lock that in place. The reason for the stop block is if I was doing this on all four corners, I could then just rotate the frame there and make a cut there for the next gusset. I'm all set. Let's start making our cut. If I was gusseting all four corners, I'd make the shoulder cut on each one before moving the stop block back. Repeated passes over the blade remove the remaining waste out to the corner. Now this would go a lot faster with a dado blade, but I wanted to show you that it can be done without one too. So there's my groove cut in here for my gusset. It's got a little cleanup to do. Do that back over the bench with a sanding block. That's looking pretty good. Take a look. Okay, that's a pretty good fit. That's just a smidge above the surface of the frame. I can easily sand that flush after I get the gusset glued in place here. What I need to do now is mark the length of the piece of my gusset. It's just about there, a little over long. Take that to the table saw, cut that off, come back and glue it in. You can glue your gusset in just about any grain orientation you please. If you want to, again, create an accent with the grain orientation of the frame. This one I'm going to go ahead and just glue it in so I think I like it actually running the same direction as the mahogany. So some glue in the recess here. Rub it around my trusty glue spreader. Put that in position. Clamp it. So I took a moment there to cut down and sand that gusset flush. It's nice and flush to the outside faces, and it gives, if you look at just the one corner there, it gives a nice accent. You can imagine that in the other four corners be a nice accent for the frame. Now the fourth method for reinforcing a miter is the spline, as I mentioned. I'm going to do it on this corner here, and I've marked this one just so I don't cut into the nails that I put in previously. A spline is, think of the gusset, only you're going to put it into the middle of the thickness of these two pieces. I'm going to use the same material I used for my gusset, and to get that in there I obviously need to cut a slot right through the center of the thickness of these frame pieces. We'll do that over the table saw with a special sled. Here's the sled, and it's really fairly simple. Just a piece of MDF here, and I've got two other narrow pieces of MDF that are glued on here at a 90-degree angle to each other, and they're each at 45 degrees to the table. This is going to be a cradle that carries the frame past the blade to make that cut. We have to do a little bit of setup first. First I want to know how deep to make that cut. This particular spline, I want to go about 3/4 of an inch deep. All right, now I'm just going to rest this in the cradle here, bring it up next to the blade, and raise the blade so it's the highest tooth just touches that line. All righty, I'm going to lock the height adjustment so the blade doesn't drift downward. Next I have to adjust this so that I can position that cut right in the center. To do that, I know my frame is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I'm going to set the blade just a little more than 3/8 of an inch to one side. Bring the rip fence up. This rides against the rip fence. So adjust the rip fence so that the edge of the jig is just a little over 1/4 of an inch from the tooth, and that'll give me a gap that's probably just under 1/4 inch, but I'll widen this with some small adjustments as we go. Now before I make a cut in my frame, I'm going to make a test cut, just to make a slot through the jig itself so I can double check my rib fence placement. Yep, I think that's where I want to start, so I'm ready to start making slots in the frame. Okay, just a little bit narrow. I'm going to make an adjustment, recut the slot, and we should be right on the money. Okay, I'm at the point where I've got a very, very close fit. So close that I don't think I want to make that fine of an adjustment on my table saw. What I'm going to do instead is sand this spline just a little bit to get the perfect fit. There we go, nice fit there. Now what I'm going to do is just going to cut off a small piece of this spline material, glue it in here, and then after the glue dries, like we did with the gusset, we'll trim and sand it flush with the edges. You can take this same concept of splines for other types of joinery as well. For example, here's two boards joined end to end. There's a slot in each, and we've used a hardboard spline in this case to do glue. You can take two boards, fasten them end to end. Here's an edge-to-edge joint where you're taking narrower boards, making a wider panel by cutting matching slots and putting a spline in between. Spline joints can also be used when you're building cabinets. If you have, for example, a butt joint like this where a shelf would join a cabinet side, or the top of a cabinet would join the side, you can again slot these pieces, add a spline if that will reinforce the joint. Here where you're putting end grain to face grain, a spline would be a good idea to add some face grain gluing surface to that joint. Now, to do a spline joint like this, you need to cut matching slots in each piece. And there are several ways to do that. You can get a variety of slot cutting bits. These come in different widths. You can use these either in a handheld router or at a router table. I'll show you how to do each of those. You can also cut those slots on the table saw, and we'll discuss that too. First, let's go with a handheld router. Just going to set up a router mat here to keep my pieces from sliding around. Take a couple of these boards and we'll cut matching slots in the edges so that we can edge join them like we did these two. All I gotta do is put the piece on the bench, just extending a little bit over the edge there so my router bit's gonna clear. I've got my router bit adjusted so that this cuts a slot that is just slightly off center of the thickness of this piece. What I'll do is I'll route a slot on one face, flip it over, and do the same, and we'll end up with a centered slot and see if that fits our spline stock. Terrific, that fits like a glove. I'm ready to cut the slots in the mating piece. There we go. Nice friction fit there. Mating piece goes on. You can see how nicely that's aligned on both faces. Can't even feel that seam across there. Working with a slot cutter bit and a handheld router works especially well if you've got larger pieces and you can't really work with them that easily. My preference, though, is if I can, I'd just as soon mount that slot cutter bit in the router table, and I'll show you how to do that. I've positioned the router table fence so it aligns with the bearing of the bit. That way the piece moves smoothly past the bit while the bit cuts at full depth. A push pad grips the stock and moves it safely past the bit and keeps your fingers a safe distance away. Flipping the piece over for a second pass centers the slot on the thickness. Slots can also be cut on the table saw. First, set the blade height. Then position the rip fence to cut just slightly off center. Then make a pass with each face against the rip fence to create the centered slot. Now, if you want to groove the end of a workpiece at the table saw, you want to stand it on end, this can be a little dicey. The tall piece can kind of rock a little bit as you walk it along the rip fence. So instead, make yourself a little saddle jig like this one. This is just some MDF. It's real simple to make. The first thing you do is cut a piece that's exactly as wide as your rip fence. You cut two pieces that go on either side and then glue them together right around your rip fence so you have a nice sliding fit. Then glue an upright on the back here. Make sure this is 90 degrees to the saw table. And now this extra height here and this stop back here gives you extra support so that when you're pushing this across the saw table, you're going to have a much stabler workpiece. But you do have to consider the thickness of this and reset the fence to make your slot cut. There, we've got a nice groove in the end of that workpiece, made it safely with our jig that kept things from rocking back and forth. To slot the end of a workpiece at the router table, back it up with a wide scrap. This provides a broad, stable surface against the fence so the piece doesn't wobble, and it also prevents tear out on the back edge where the bit exits. Biscuit joints share some of the characteristics of a slot and spline joint. Here in this cutaway biscuit joint, you can see what a biscuit joint really is. There's two semicircular grooves that are cut in the mating pieces. And then this little oval football-shaped thing is the actual biscuit. And it's glued into the slot, and that gives plenty of face grain to face grain gluing surface on those two boards. You can see a little better here in this mitered joint what it really looks like. You've got two matching slots cut in mating pieces, and then the biscuit is glued into that slot. The two pieces are assembled, and once the glue dries, you have a nice solid bond there. Now, biscuits do add a little bit of mechanical strength to a joint, but I think they're really primarily better used as alignment aids. On a joint like this one, where again we have end grain meeting edge grain, you do increase the strength of that joint significantly by adding the face grain to face grain of a biscuit. Same thing with a miter. You have an end grain to end grain joint primarily. A biscuit there can help that mitered joint increase the strength of that mitered joint significantly. If you're going to be doing joints that are edge grain to edge grain already, a very strong glue joint, adding biscuits to that really doesn't increase the strength that significantly. But in that case, it does help keep that joint aligned so that when you're gluing things up, it doesn't slip up and down. Biscuits are very easy to cut. They go very quickly. You can also join boards in a variety of combinations, whether you're doing something like for a face frame, where you'd have end to edge. If you're doing a shelf into a cabinet side, where you've got, again, end into edge. They're very versatile joints. They're cut with a biscuit jointer, special tool. It has a fence and a motor, and if you look closely, as you plunge the motor forward, you can see the little circular blade that exposes itself down along the bottom of the fence. That blade, of course, is what cuts that semicircular slot. Let me show you how this works. So let's say I want to make an edge-to-edge joint with these two boards here. I want the ends to align perfectly. To start making a biscuit joint, I just decide, where do I want my biscuits? I want one there, and I want one there. Just make lines across that joint line. Doesn't really matter where they are, just don't want to put too many in, and you don't want too few. So on the boards that long, about two seems right. Take one board, turn it around. I'm just going to clamp this to the bench so it doesn't slide on me. There's a mark centered on the fence. Align that mark with the mark you made on the edge of the board, pull the trigger, and plunge the tool in. Same thing over here. Move my clamp down just a bit. Align that mark with that, pull the trigger. Just that quickly, that board is done. Let's do the mate. Now the slots I cut were for the largest biscuits, which are number 20. And we'll put a biscuit in each one just to test our fit. And that's ready for glue up. Now, one thing you'll notice about biscuit joints, I mentioned I want these boards to be perfectly flush on the ends. I've got a little bit of play there, so I can slide them back and forth. So it's a very forgiving joint too. To glue up, just a matter of putting a little bit of glue in each slot and then clamping the pieces together. Let that dry. Now, this is an edge-to-edge joint. You should probably put extra glue on there, but I just want to demonstrate the biscuit joinery for this purpose. Now, if you want to take a couple of pieces and join them in a T, such as you're putting a shelf or a divider in a cabinet, process is very similar. We're going to put one biscuit right in the middle, or about in the middle. Just make a mark there and there, no measuring needed. The piece that's going to be the shelf, we're going to mark where that goes, right along there. Take this one, clamp it to the bench, and make the slot in the end. Okay, now to do the mating slot in the middle, I'm going to adjust the fence so it's up like that. Again, use my mark. Align the fence right along my line. There's a mark on the base there that I align with the mark on the workpiece. And I'm going to take my one I just cut here, put the edges flush, help it square up the tool to the mark, and make the cut. Now the number 20 biscuit in there. See how well things line up. Right on the pencil mark. So now with some glue in that joint, that's going to be a nice reinforcement for a end grain to face grain joint. Okay, let's talk a little bit more in detail about biscuits and biscuit joinery. There are three sizes of biscuits. You've got a 0, a 10, and a 20. A 0, 10, and a 20. And they get bigger with the bigger numbers. You can see the 0 compared to the 20, quite a bit difference in length. That brings us to a point that you need to consider is the width of your workpiece when you're cutting biscuits. Here in this mitered joint, I have a number 0 biscuit. It fits fine in this mitered joint. Slot doesn't cut through the ends. Now, however, if I were to try to cut a 0 slot in the end of this 2-inch wide workpiece, you can see that the biscuit itself is almost as wide as the workpiece. If I were to cut a slot that wide in there, those slots would show there. So you must have a piece at least 2 1/4 inches wide for a 0 biscuit and progressively wider for each of the larger sizes. Another tip, going back to our edge glued panel where I glued in the biscuits, you do not want to start gluing up biscuits and then immediately sand the panel after that glue is still dry or still wet. You want to wait at least overnight to allow the glue to dry, and here's why. When you add the glue to the biscuits, these biscuits are compressed beech. Some of that water in the glue causes the biscuits to swell slightly, and that raises just an ever so slight bump in the joint on your panel. If you start sanding that while that's raised, then as the glue evaporates and the glue dries, the water evaporates, you're going to have a little depression there where you sanded. That's going to shrink back down. So if you're going to use biscuits for edge gluing joints, glue in the biscuits, allow the assembly to dry for at least 8 hours, just let it sit overnight, then come back the next day and then do your sanding. You won't have any trouble that way. A rabbet joint is really the simplest of the mechanical joints. A rabbet, that's spelled with an ET on the end, not an IT like the little critter in your backyard. A rabbet is simply a cut made along the edge or the end of a workpiece that accepts a mating piece. Here in this little mock-up cabinet, the top has a rabbet along each end, and those rabbets fit the sides perfectly. There's a little bit of mechanical strength in that the shoulders on the rabbet help resist a little bit of racking if the cabinet gets knocked side to side, and of course the resistance to downward pressure there too. So in addition to typically fastening a cabinet top onto its sides, you can also rabbet the back of a cabinet to inset the panel for the back. On this drawer, we've got a real simple drawer front made with the rabbet in the drawer front that accepts the drawer sides. Nice thing about rabbets is they are very simple to cut, and you can do them with a variety of tools. You can do it with a handheld router, you can do it on the router table, and you can do it on the table saw, and I'll walk you through all those. We'll start with the handheld router. This router, I've got a special bit. It's called a rabbeting bit. You can see it's got the cutter on it, and what's special about it is it's got this bearing down here. This bearing rides against the edge of the workpiece, and the different diameter of the bearing and the cutting edge of the bit is the width of the rabbet. So you can change out bearings, buy bits with different size bearings so you can cut rabbets of different widths. Let me show you how this works. It's really pretty simple. I can see that 1/2-inch rabbeting bit makes a perfect fit for a mating piece of 1/2-inch MDF. Next method is to use, if you don't have a rabbeting bit like that, you have a straight bit in your bit cabinet. A straight bit can also be used to route a rabbet along the edge of a workpiece. The one thing you'll need to do though is add a way to guide the router. I'm going to change out the bits and we'll get set up for that. I've mounted a 3/4 inch straight bit in the router now. And when you're routing a rabbet with a straight bit, you need some way to guide the router so that it just doesn't go dancing all across the panel, ruining the cut. With a rabbeting bit, you have the advantage of a built-in bearing that rides against the edge of the panel. With a straight bit, there's no such thing. So we need a way to guide that bit rather. And this simple jig is a very handy item to have in your shop. This is just a couple pieces of MDF. One's the top piece is a fence, the bottom piece is a base. Glue and screw the fence to the base. You want to make the fence about a little wide so you can have enough room for clamps back here without interfering with the base of the router. And the width of the base is determined by the distance from the cutting edge of the bit to the edge of your router base, 2.5 inches in this case. So when I made this jig, I made it so it extended a little more than 2.5 inches past the fence. Call it 2 5/8. Then I took the router bit in my router and I trimmed that edge. So now I know exactly where that 3/4 inch bit is going to cut when I run the base of the router along that fence. One other advantage to using a straight bit to cut a rabbet is that you can cut a rabbet that is actually narrower than the bit. Even though this is a 3/4 inch bit, I'm going to cut a rabbet that fits 3/4 inch plywood. It's called 3/4 inch plywood, but it's always just a skosh under. So if you want a rabbet that fits that perfectly, you can do that with this method. Use the piece that's going to fit into the rabbet as a gauge, align it with the edge of the panel, and then just bring the jig right up to the other side. Check along the cut. When you've got the jig aligned, you want to just clamp it in place. Double check. That looks very good. And I'm ready to route this rabbet. So there is a rabbet that perfectly fits that 3/4 inch plywood panel. Now you can also use the rabbeting bit and a straight bit on the router table. I'll show you that. To cut a rabbet with a straight bit, set the height of the bit for the depth of the rabbet, then measure from the outside edge of the bit to the fence to set the width of the rabbet, then lock the fence in place. Then just run the workpiece along the fence to cut the rabbet. When using a rabbeting bit on the router table, again set the bit height for the depth of the rabbet, then set the bearing flush with the fence faces. You can also cut a rabbet narrower than the rabbeting bit by simply moving the fence to bury more of the bit. To cut a rabbet on the table saw, you could use just a standard blade and make a whole bunch of repeat cuts across the blade. That works. It does tend to leave a lot of score marks where each time the blade went past you might have a score mark. A better way to do it is to get yourself a dado blade. This is a 6-inch dado blade, and it consists of a kind of a miniature, a 6-inch in diameter chipper that goes on the outside. There's actually 2 of these when you fit them into the saw. And then there's a series of chippers that go between the 2 outside blades. And by stacking these together on the arbor, you come up with a much wider blade, makes a wider cut. So by changing the number of chippers in there, you can vary the width of your cut. I've got this set up, kind of just an arbitrary number, about 5/8 inch wide, and I'll show you why I'm not too concerned about the actual width of the blade here in just a moment. Get this snug down. With a dado blade, you're going to need an insert that has enough room for the blade to extend through. Now that I've got that set, the next thing to consider is the width of my rabbet. In this case, I'm going to take a piece of 1/2 inch MDF and make a rabbet that seats that MDF right in the edge of this plywood panel. I'm going to use the MDF itself as a gauge to set the width of my blade to the fence. You'll notice I've got an auxiliary fence clamped to my rip fence, and here's why. I need to raise the blade into that fence to bury part of it, so I'm only exposing exactly 1/2 inch. So I'm going to lower the blade, bring it over so that auxiliary fence just covers the outside chipper, and then cut into it. Quick check, I've got it, it looks good. Set my blade height for the depth of the rabbet, 3/8 of an inch. Now I'm going to position the rip fence so it exactly matches the width of the MDF. Just put the MDF next to there, and using my fingers as a very sensitive gauge, I can tap the fence over until the outside of that tooth is perfectly flush with the face of the MDF. Feels like that's perfect. Okay, now with the width set, my height set, I'm ready to make a rabbet in my panel. There you can see that 1/2 inch MDF fits perfectly in that rabbet. Edges are flush. Now I can even cut a wider rabbet without changing my setup too much, without changing the blade, simply by moving the fence over a little bit to expose more blade. Or if I need a narrower rabbet, push the fence toward the blade. You do want to be careful though that if you've got a blade that's about 3/4 of an inch in width, and your auxiliary fence is also 3/4 of an inch in width, you're not getting too close to your metal fence and you cut into it. A rabbet is a cut on the edge of a board or a panel. A dado or a groove is a cut made in the middle of a panel. For example, on our mock-up cabinet here, I've got a shelf that is housed in a dado. Now, dados and grooves can be used, as we've done here, to put an internal component into the side of a cabinet, a vertical divider, a shelf. You can also see it on this drawer. We've got a back that's inset so ways, so when you pull out the drawer, you see the back, and then you realize you need to stop before you pull it all the way out. That back is housed in a dado, and even the bottom of this drawer is in a groove, cut made on the interior of the board. Now first, let's talk about the difference in dados and grooves. They look similar, but it's just a little bit of semantics here. The groove is a cut in the middle that runs with the grain. A dado is a cut in the middle of a panel or board that runs across the grain. Dado runs across the grain, groove runs with the grain. So if you're reading through plans and working on building a project and they refer to a dado or a groove, that gives you a clue as to which direction that cut is made relative to the grain. Like a rabbet, you can cut dados and grooves in a variety of ways, using the router at the router table and at the table saw. We'll start with a handheld router. To cut a dado or a groove, you can use a straight bit in your router. I've got a 1/2 inch straight bit mounted here. And I'm going to be cutting a dado and a groove that will fit 3/4 inch plywood. I want to make a groove in this panel first. I've got my position for the panel laid out here. What I've done is mark one side of the groove at each end And I've made an X. That's to indicate the waste area. That's the area where I want the groove to fall. I've got two of the jig that I used for routing rabbets. One is going to go on each side of my layout line to essentially trap the router base and route the groove to the desired width. First thing to do is to take one of these and clamp it right along my layout line. And again, since I cut these jigs to size using the bit that I have in that router, I know exactly where that bit is going to cut, right along the edge of the jig. So this defines one side of that groove. Now to set the second one, I've got this scrap, this cutoff from the panel that's going to go in here. Butt it up against the first jig, put the second jig in place, make sure it's firm against there, and now clamp the second jig to the panel. So I think you can see now that where the router bit cuts, it's going to be right along the edges of the jig, give me a groove exactly as wide as that panel. See how well that fits. Like a glove. Another nice thing about cutting dados and grooves with a router is that you can create stopped dados. What that means is we've got a groove or a dado that goes only partway across the piece. It doesn't cut from one edge to the other. That gives you the benefit of not having to figure out how to hide the edge that cut through the front. With a handheld router, it's easy to make that cut, stop where you want, and then square up the end of the cut with a chisel. You can do the same process using this jig. We have to add one little piece though here, and I'll show you how to do that. Just going to spin this around. We'll cut a dado this time instead of a groove. I'll lay out my groove about 4.5 inches down. On this side of the line. And start clamping my pieces in place. Now before I clamp the other one in place, I want to figure out where I want this dado to stop. I'm going to have it come in just 2 inches from the rabbet along the front edge here. Bring in my sample piece, it's my spacer, and clamp these in place. This is my stop block. It's simply going to be double-faced tape between the two pieces of the jig to stop the bit before it reaches, as it reaches that line. So I'll put the router in place so I can see where the bit will reach to. Rotate the cutting edge of the bit so it just touches my line. And right there is where I want to put my stop block. So now when I route this groove, this dado rather, it'll come up, bump against the stop block, and we'll have a stop dado at that point. Now I have a stopped cut there. However, the corners of it are round because I'm using a round bit. So I need to take this over to the bench and with a couple cuts from the chisel, square up that end so the plywood panel fits snug to the end. Got my whitest chisel here, and I'm just using the edge of the dado as a registration surface for the back. A couple light taps there. Same on the other side. And come back and just connect the dots with a narrow chisel that'll fit in the dado. Let's check the fit. You can see it comes right up there to the end, and it's a nice clean fit, and it hides that end. Cutting dados and grooves on the table saw is best done with a dado blade. You can use a single blade if you like, if you don't have a dado set. It's just going to take a lot more passes to get the cut to the width that you need. I've got a simple method here that should guarantee you that within making 2 test cuts, you should be dead on the money to getting a groove or dado exactly as wide as you need it. This is a piece that we're going to dado into this piece over here. So I need to know how thick to make my dado stack to accept this. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stack up a variety of the chippers and blades until it's just a hair thinner than my piece. Now I'm going to start inserting the shims here. These are metal shims that come with the dado set, allow you to make really small incremental adjustments. I'm just going to add a couple in there between a couple of chippers. And what I'm after here is to make this full set just a tiny bit thicker than the thickness of this plywood. I'm going to add one more in here. And when you add spacers, try to stack them all between different sets of chippers. Don't put 2 or 3 shims between the same chippers. Now press that down because the arbor nut will compress that a little bit on the saw. Add one more. This should do it for us. There, now I can feel that tooth is a little bit above the thickness of that plywood. I'm going to take this stack, mount it in the saw, and make a test cut. As you can see, that's pretty loose in there, but that was the intent. What we're going to do now is take off the dado stack and start fitting shims in here to find the one that fits that gap. There's our first shim. Plenty of room there. Looks like all 4 of those shims can come out. So since all 4 of those shims fit in the gap, taking those out of the stack should give us a perfect fit. That is a nice, snug fit. So now that I've got a perfect fit, I can go ahead and cut these dados in my project parts. Cut dados and grooves on the router table by measuring from the fence to the cutting edge of the bit. Back up the workpiece with a scrap to stabilize it and prevent chip out on the back edge. Half lap joints are another very easy to cut joint, very strong as well. A half lap is simply a joint that is cut in two mating pieces. You take away half the thickness of both, and when they come together you have a lot of face grain to face grain gluing surface, very strong. You can cut half laps where the two boards join at the end. You can cut a half lap in the middle, or where two pieces cross like this. A half lap does provide some mechanical strength, especially when it's in partially captured like one of these two. It resists twisting back and forth. However, of course, it does lift out, so you'll need to glue these pieces together. Half laps are best cut with a dado blade on the table saw. Now, since we're going to be making a relatively wide cut here, again, it's a good idea to have a dado blade set up in your table saw. Width isn't terribly important. You're going to make several passes over the blade, so 3/4 inch, somewhere in that neighborhood is a good starting point. First thing to do is set up your miter gauge. I've simply attached a auxiliary face to my miter gauge here, a little double face tape, and that needs to extend just a little bit past the blade. The purpose of that is to back up the cut so you don't get chip out on the back side. Next, you want to set the rip fence to match the width of your workpiece. So this is one of the pieces I'll be cutting a half lap in. I want to align this so when it's up against the rip fence, this outside edge is aligned with the outside edge of the tooth on the dado blade. Okay, that feels just right. Now the next thing to set is the height of the blade. I'm going to start with it just eyeballing somewhere below half thickness of this piece. To check the blade height, make a cut on just the end of each piece. Then check the fit. Not quite there yet, need to make a little adjustment up. Okay, you can see how those two pieces slide right together. That means my blade is set at exactly the right height. I can continue on cutting the full width of this joint. So there is a nice fit on a half lap joint. That works well for cutting pieces across the end. Now I'm using the fence as a stop there to set the point where the shoulder of the cut is made. What if I'm cutting a half lap I needed in the middle like this? In that case, it's a matter of just having a little fine touch. I'm going to use my mating piece to mark where it's supposed to go. Right there, right there. And then we're going to just eyeball that, sneak up on the cut. We're going to start inside the line at each edge and then work our way out until we have a nice fit. There we go. Half lap, cut right into the middle of the field. Okay, we're just about ready to glue up this half lap. You can see that the dado blade that I was using leaves little tiny ridges across both faces of the half lap. I want to clean that up just a little bit to get a better glue surface. Sanding block, makes quick work of that. Don't have to get overly aggressive on the sanding. You don't want to change the overall depth too much. So now I've got a much cleaner fit there. Gluing up half laps, they are really one of the easiest joints there is to glue up. You need pretty much just one clamp at each joint. Place some glue on one face, even it out so it covers the full face of the joint. Put the mating piece in place and clamp right at the middle of the joint. If you have a half lap at the end like this, double check that it hasn't slipped in either direction so that it's flush on all faces. A half lap like this one, you'll also want to check that it hasn't slipped out this way. A half lap like this will self-register, so once you've got that one clamped, it's not going to slide around on you. So there's 9 different kinds of joints and a wide variety of applications for each of them, from cabinets to frames to panels, doors, drawers, boxes. I'm kind of hard pressed to think of any application where you wouldn't be able to use at least one of these joints. So get out in your shop and practice, and I hope you'll visit us in the pages of Wood Magazine or check us out online at woodmagazine.com for more project plans and techniques.